If you're in Canada, your $5 cup of coffee is going to cost you more than $5. Once you add tax and tip, you'll be looking at $9, $12, maybe even more, depending on how much you decide to tip. These days, a tip is not just appreciated, it is expected. When did getting a cup of coffee become a moral dilemma? Tipping can be a very tricky subject, and when you travel, it gets even more confusing. Is it mandatory? How much do I tip? When do I tip? Is it genuinely optional? In Canada, tipping 15 to 20% on top of your final bill is generally expected. Leaving less than that could be read as dissatisfaction with the service, or maybe that you're just being cheap. There are two sides to this story. On one hand, are those that say, if you don't want to tip, then maybe just don't go out. And on the other hand, are those that feel that the burden for us to tip so that service providers, especially the servers, can get decent wages is because the employers have decided not to pay workers well. Honestly, both parties have a solid argument. Canadians are generally very nice people, but I don't think we are that nice to want to give out so much money every single time we have to step out of the house. Especially not now when the economy is not as good as it used to be. There's also the dilemma of knowing exactly when to tip or who to tip. I know the waiter at the restaurant or the barista at the coffee shop is expecting me to give a tip. That's okay. My pizza delivery guy is expecting one too. The lady at the nail shop or the people at the hair salon also expect me to tip. So, pretty much most service workers. But my optometrist provides a service. My lawyer provides a service. My dentist provides a service. I don't tip at these places. I don't even tip my personal trainer. Look, I just got a plate here and I tipped already. And then I came back a few minutes later for a bottle of water and is asking me to tip again. The frustration most Canadians have isn't really with the workers asking for tips. It's with the system that made it necessary in the first place, and the technology that expanded it well beyond where it ever made sense. The history of tipping goes back further than most people realize. I decided to make a trip to a couple of my favorite knowledge zones to see if I could find some answers to my many questions. The tipping practice has roots in the 16th century feudal Europe, where giving small amounts of money to servants for good service was a mark of social status. American and Canadian travelers encountered it in Europe and, in their infinite wisdom, decided to bring it back to North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At first, it was reserved for truly exceptional service, for anyone that went meaningfully above and beyond. But over time, it evolved from an occasional recognition into a standing expectation. The version of tipping that took hold in North America, especially in the United States, carried something that the European tipping never did, and that's the direct connection to wage structure. As tipping became embedded in American hospitality and food service through the early 20th century, employers discovered it could actually function as a wage subsidy. If customers could be counted on to tip, employers could pay less. Over the decades, this logic added into law, and it became the American tip minimum wage. Canada absorbed the tipping culture, but the legal wage architecture, as we will see later on, did not cross in the same form. And that gap is where a lot of the current frustration still lies. By the mid 20th century, tipping in Canada had settled into a very fairly stable contract. You go to a restaurant, you sit down, a server looks over you over the cost of your meal. At the end, you leave 15%, maybe 20%. Everybody understood the deal, and that held for a very long time. To understand what changed in Canada, we need to look at the three tipping cultures that exist in the developed world. Let's start in Europe. In most of Western Europe, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, tipping actually exists, but it's genuinely optional, like really optional. In Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Tipping is not really customary at all. You can round up, that's acceptable, but a separate tip is often unnecessary. In most European countries, the credit card slips don't even have a tip line. If you want a tip, you typically would leave cash. European hospitality workers are generally paid a full living wage, so the cost of service is priced into the total bill. Now for the United States. As of 2025, the federal minimum wage in the US is $7.25 an hour. For tipped workers, the federal minimum cash wage is $2.13 an hour. The US law assumes that tips will bring tipped workers up to at least the standard minimum. And if they don't, then the employer is legally required to make up the difference. So for the US, tipping in a restaurant at 20% is not just custom, it's a genuine economic function. So the moral case for tipping in America is real and valid because the structural case is real. The wage floor was already designed with tips as part of the equation. And then there's Canada. Canada imported that tipping culture, but we did not import the wage architecture that justifies it. In Canada, we don't have a federal tip minimum wage that sits below the general minimum wage the way it does in the US. Most provinces already pay servers the general provincial minimum wage, which is around $15 to $17 an hour, depending on the province. So the original premise of the North American tip was that it supplemented wages that were legally kept low. In Canada, that premise is weak. Canadian servers are not working for $2.13 an hour. So the custom imported the expectation, but the law did not import the justification. What has blown all of this up now is a combination of rising wages and new technology arriving all at the same moment. Between 2017 and 2023, most Canadian provinces went through significant minimum wage increases. As of today, minimum wage in Ontario is $17.60 per hour. Which raises an obvious question. If servers are already earning minimum wage, why are tips still expected? A study commissioned by H&R Block found that 93% of Canadians are annoyed by tip prompts. 89% think tipping amounts are already too high. 67% want tipping abolished altogether. 41% say they actively avoid businesses with aggressive tipping practices. Which is kind of ironic, right? We built this entire whole system to support workers, and now, majority of Canadians think it's actually doing the opposite. The argument for tipping has always been it rewards great service, and it supplements wages that would otherwise be too low. But if minimum wages have risen, if tips are being taxed before they reach a worker's paycheck, and if the prompt now appears whether you ordered at a counter or sat through a 3-course meal, what exactly are we solving for at this point? Another layer is that tipping has also expanded beyond its original context. So what used to be reserved for clear service-heavy interactions like sit-down restaurants, taxis, hotel staff, you now see it at coffee shop counters, at bubble tea windows, at food courts, at self-serve kiosks, and in some retail environments. Delivery apps are a whole other story. The other layer that inverts the original logic entirely. Some of them allow drivers to see the estimated tip amounts before accepting an order. If a tip is supposed to be an appreciation for the good service, why am I tipping before the service has been delivered? Looks like the lines have been blurred, and the technology that blurs them is worth understanding in detail because it's been a whole lot of work here. Think about how tipping used to work. You paid in cash, you looked at the bill, you made a decision privately, and then you left something behind. Or you didn't, no judgment. Today, the decision happens on the screen before you complete your payment, with a worker in front of you staring at you, a line of people behind you, and 3 large buttons suggesting amounts to you by default. 18%, 20%, 25%. You're not just choosing a tip, you're actually reacting to how the system is designed, with social pressure as well. Tipping in Canada isn't just culture anymore, it's product design. Around 2010, tablet-based POS systems began replacing traditional cash registers across Canadian food service. Every single business owner can now choose what percentages appear, how many buttons to show, whether the no tip option is visible as a primary option if it's secondary, and what order these options appear in. The vendors have data on all of these across millions of transactions. They know that if they put a higher default percentage, they'll get higher average tips. They also know that minimizing that no tip option raises the average tip rate. So the defaults are not neutral, they are very well optimized. And the merchant that configures the higher defaults will see higher average tip revenue. There's a second dimension here that also almost never gets discussed, and it sits in the economics of how card payments actually work. When you tap your credit card as a Canadian merchant, the merchant pays a processing fee to accept that payment. So with your Visa or your MasterCard credit card, the interchange rates, that's the fee that would flow to the bank, like RBC, TD, CIBC, Scotia. That rate typically runs from between 1.4% and 2.4% of transaction value here in Canada, depending on the type of card. If you have a premium travel rewards card, then the rate is probably higher. When you add a tip to a card transaction, the tip is included in the total that the interchange fee is calculated on. So if you pay $6 for a cup of coffee and you had a $1.50 tip, the merchant would pay interchange on $7.50, not on $6. The use of cash in Canada has declined dramatically over the past 15 years. Contactless payments accelerated that decline significantly during the pandemic, and now that's almost the norm in majority of Canadian retail transactions. When you pay with cash, you don't need any tip prompts, right? You hand over a $20 bill, you get your change. The tip decision belongs entirely to you. There's no screen involved. You decide if you want to tip, if you don't want to tip, if you want to leave some cash behind, that's up to you. But as cash decline, exposure to tip prompts increased with it. So now most transactions are moving through digital checkout flow, where the gratuity request is already built into the payment process. So the tip prompt is not an exception. It has become more or less the default architecture of paying. And that architecture is about to get faster. Canada is currently rolling out its real-time rail system. That's the faster payments infrastructure, where digital transactions are instant. So that means the design choices are being made now. What the default percentages will be, the visibility of the no tip option, the number of screens between payments and decline, all of that would influence how you tip over time. So with all of this now, with the higher tips, more prompts, more places asking you to tip, who actually benefits? Because this is really not just about consumers, we as Canadians being annoyed. There's a real question about whether all of this tipping is actually helping the workers it's supposed to help. Let's look at the workers. On the surface, it seems obvious. If I tip more, that should mean more money for my service, right? In some cases, that's true. In full service dining or full service restaurants where the case for tipping is strongest, those tips actually represent a meaningful supplement to base wages. But when you tip through a card machine, that money often doesn't go directly into someone's pocket. It typically goes to the business first. From there, then they pull it together and redistribute across the staff or maybe add to payroll. But how the tip gets distributed is set by the employer. You as a customer, you have little information about where that money actually goes. If we look on the side of the businesses, tipping is actually a way for them to offset labor costs. Instead of the business bearing the full cost of competitive wages, some of the workers' income can actually come from tips. So that way the cost of service is shared between the employer and the person standing at the counter or dining at the restaurant. Let's look at the angle from the POS vendors and the card networks. The POS software vendors have actually designed checkout flows with full awareness of how default defects work. They know that defaults produce higher tip averages, so they sell this as a feature to merchants. If consumers pay higher tips, then you have happier workers. If you have happier workers, then it's better retention. The POS vendors benefit from merchants' retention, so their interests are very aligned with the tip prompt optimization. The card networks as well also collect interchange on every single dollar that moves through a card transaction, including tips. Higher transaction values means marginally higher interchange revenue at scale across millions of daily transactions. Nobody disclosed any of this to you at the point of sale. The screen just said, do you want to give 18% or 22% or 25% as tip? So that tip you're leaving thinking it's going straight into someone's pocket is probably passing through a system with multiple hands before it gets anywhere near that pocket. And each of the systems has their own rational interest in the transaction. There's a whole other dimension to this story about how tips get reported as taxable income. But the CRA has never needed my help finding money, and I don't intend to start now. But I'd like to know, if you work in the service industry, do you expect tips? Do you look down on customers that do not tip? If you work at a restaurant, do you get paid all of the tip that comes via card payments, or do you have to share this with the chefs in the kitchen? And for everyone else, do you still tip everywhere, or have you started drawing the line somewhere? This is a completely judgment-free zone. Honestly, I cannot tell you how much to tip or if to even tip on every transaction. But the next time you're staring down at that screen looking at the different tip percentage suggestions, just know you're not alone. There are many other Canadians facing the same dilemma as you are. If you're visiting Canada and want to understand what things actually cost across different cities, beyond the tip of course, here's a playlist for you here. Until next time, thanks and see you soon.